They say evil wears many faces, but rarely the ones we expect. When we picture a serial killer, the image that forms in our minds is almost always the same. A man, a predator, someone lurking in the shadows, violent, aggressive, leaving behind chaos in his wake. That's the story society tells us, but it isn't the whole story. Because what happens when the face of evil is not a man at all? Imagine this: a nurse leaning over a patient's bedside, her voice calm, her smile reassuring, as a syringe slowly empties into the veins of someone who will never wake again. A grandmother. Her hair is gray, her hands are gentle, rocking in a chair as her fourth husband slips into an early grave. A noblewoman, draped in velvet, whispering prayers while dozens of young girls disappear behind her castle walls. This is the world of female serial killers, a world we rarely speak about. And perhaps that silence is the most terrifying part of all. Female serial killers are rare, at least compared to their male counterparts. But rare doesn't mean insignificant. In fact, it makes them more dangerous. Because when a woman kills, the world is slow to suspect her. Society has taught us to see women as nurturers, as caregivers, as protectors, and for centuries, that very perception has been their sharpest weapon. Men, when they kill, often leave blood and chaos in their path. Their crimes scream for attention. Women, on the other hand, often kill quietly, methodically, with a patience that chills the soul. A teaspoon of poison slipped into a meal, medicine dosed just a little too high, the soft, suffocating weight of a pillow pressed against someone's face. No screams, no spectacle, just death, creeping in silence, while trust blinds everyone around them. And history is filled with examples. Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian countess, accused of bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty. Nanny Doss, the cheerful grandmother from Oklahoma, who murdered husbands and family members alike, all while wearing her trademark smile. Dorothea Puente, the kindly old woman running a boarding house in California, who buried her tenants in the garden while cashing their social security checks. Again and again, their lives seemed ordinary, even saintly, until the truth claws its way to the surface. But here's the most unsettling truth. Many of these women got away with it for years, decades in some cases. Why? Because no one was looking. No one thought to suspect the gentle caregiver, the grieving widow, the kindly neighbor. Their murders weren't seen as murders at all. They were written off as accidents, as illnesses, as tragedies. And that is what makes their crimes so terrifying. Not just the act itself, but the invisibility of it, the perfect mask of innocence. As we pull back the curtain tonight, we'll step into that unsettling world. A world where killers didn't just rely on brute strength, but on patience, deception, and society's own blindness. A world where murder wasn't fueled by sudden rage, but by strategy, control, greed, and sometimes even pleasure. These women didn't just kill, they calculated, they planned, they charmed their way into trust, and then shattered it in the darkest way possible. So prepare yourself, because once we begin this journey, you'll start to question everything you thought you knew about evil. You'll realize that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they laugh. Sometimes they look exactly like the people you trust the most. And that is the most chilling truth of all.
In the soot-stained streets of Victorian England, amid the gas lamps and narrow alleyways, a quiet horror festered behind closed doors. The poor and desperate often had little choice, and for unwed mothers, the shame of illegitimacy could be a death sentence for their children. Into this bleak world stepped Amelia Dyer, a trained nurse, a mother, and eventually a baby farmer. At first glance, she offered salvation, a warm home, a mother's touch, a future. But what many did not realize was that this savior had a deadly secret. Over the course of 30 chilling years, hundreds of infants would vanish into her care, never to be seen again. What followed would become one of the most horrifying serial killing cases in British history, leaving a nation in shock, a river filled with corpses, and a legal system scrambling to fill the gaping holes in its child protection laws. She presented herself as a savior, kind, maternal, soft-spoken, a respectable woman with a country home, a cradle waiting, and arms open for the unwanted. Young mothers, shamed by society and abandoned by the fathers of their babies, turned to her as their last hope. They handed over their infants with trembling hands, whispering goodbyes they never imagined would be final. But behind that gentle smile was something darker. Amelia Dyer was no ordinary woman. She had once trained as a nurse, married twice, and borne children of her own. But somewhere along the way, compassion turned into calculation. By the time she entered the world of baby farming, she had become a master of deception, willing to play whatever role was required to earn trust, to take the coin, and to kill. In Victorian England, baby farming was a grim solution to an even grimmer reality. Unwed mothers, cut off from financial support and cast out by a puritanical society, often gave up their newborns to caretakers for a one-time payment, believing their children would be raised in secret, safe, and anonymous. Amelia offered them peace of mind. What she gave them instead was silence. At first, she allowed babies to die through neglect, malnourished, sick, forgotten in the corners of damp rooms. It was cruel, but quiet. She was caught once and sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. But instead of reforming her, prison taught Amelia a new trick. Discretion. She stopped involving doctors. No more certificates, no more witnesses. The babies began to vanish. Her method? A length of white tape, just long enough to loop around a newborn's neck twice. A quick knot. No noise, no struggle, and no one to hear their last breaths. She told police later, almost without remorse, "You can tell it's one of mine by the tape." For years, she drifted from town to town, name to name. Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Harding, Mother. Each alias a clean slate, each house a killing field. Mothers would drop off their babies at the front door, and within hours they were dead, stripped of their clothing, sometimes buried in the garden. More often weighed down and dumped in the river. In January of 1896, Dyer answered an ad from Evelina Marmon, a 25-year-old barmaid who had just given birth to a baby girl named Doris. Desperate to hide the scandal, Evelina offered to pay $10 to a respectable woman who would care for her child. Dyer arrived with a kind smile and calm demeanor. She collected the baby and the money, and that same night, she strangled Doris with the familiar white tape. She didn't stop there. Another baby boy, Harry Simmons, died just a day later, strangled with the same tape that had killed Doris, but her downfall was already sealed. Days earlier, the body of a baby had been found floating in the Thames. Inside the parcel, police found a clue. A name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address. It was the thread they needed to unravel the entire tapestry of horror. Detectives staked out her home and raided it on Good Friday, 1896. The smell of death clung to the walls. Children's clothing was everywhere. Letters from desperate mothers, pawn tickets, telegrams, but no living children. The river gave up more of her secrets. 6 more bodies were pulled from the waters, including Doris and Harry, all strangled, all wrapped, all silent. Arrested and charged with murder, Dyer offered a chilling confession. Her trial at the Old Bailey gripped the public. She pled guilty to 1 murder, but everyone knew there were many more. Hundreds, perhaps. She kept a journal in prison, 5 books filled with memories, names, details. Her only explanation? Isn't this enough? The jury didn't take long, just 4.5 minutes. On June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. As she stood on the scaffold, asked if she had any final words, she simply said, "I have nothing to say." When Amelia Dyer was finally hanged in 1896, it marked the end of her killing spree, but not the end of the damage she'd done. Her case led to nationwide reforms, but even then, the shadows of her crimes lingered. How many children truly died at her hands? We may never know. She died with her secrets, and yet her name remains etched in infamy, not just as a murderer, but as a symbol of a society that failed its most vulnerable. If you found this story haunting, chilling, or thought-provoking, subscribe for more twisted tales from history's darkest corners, because sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the shadows. They sit smiling in the parlor, cradling your child. They didn't use guns, or knives, or even rope. No, these women used something far more silent, far more insidious. Arsenic, mixed in tea, slipped into soup, stirred into wine, And the worst part? They didn't just kill their enemies, they killed their husbands, their parents, even their own sons. This is not fiction. This happened in a quiet Hungarian village where death became a daily custom. They were known as the Angel Makers of Nagyarev. Nagyarev, Hungary, early 1900s. A place where time seemed to stand still, and secrets buried deeper than the graves that would soon fill its soil. At the center of this chilling story is a midwife, Zuzanna Fazekas. She wasn't just delivering babies. She was delivering death. For years, Zuzanna quietly armed dozens of women. Wives trapped in brutal marriages, daughters burdened by sick parents, lovers scorned, with a deadly recipe made from flypaper. Boil it, skim it, poison them. She asked only one thing: why put up with them? The bodies began to pile up. Husbands, in-laws, even toddlers. And the most terrifying part? No one seemed to notice, because Zuzanna was also the village's healer. And her cousin? The man who signed the death certificates. Over the next 18 years, Nagyarev would earn a name soaked in whispers. The Murder District. The Angel Makers of Nagyarev, Hungarian, Tiszazug Marikevarok, Tiszazug poison mixers, were not your typical murderers. They didn't stalk alleyways or use weapons in the night. They wore aprons, stirred soups, and kissed their children goodnight. Yet behind the lace curtains of rural Hungarian homes, they orchestrated a quiet slaughter. This group of 26 women and 2 men from villages across the Tiszantal region were suspected of committing one of the most disturbing and coordinated series of poisonings in European history. Between 1911 and 1929, they were linked to a confirmed 45-50 murders and a suspected 300 more. The true number may never be known. Some say it could have been many, many more. Justice came slowly. 8 of the suspects received life sentences. 2 were given shorter prison terms. 6 were sentenced to death, although only 3 were actually executed. Their poison of choice? Arsenic. And their supplier, and in many cases, their moral accomplice, was a local midwife named Zuzanna Fazekas, née Ola. She didn't carry a weapon. She carried trust. Their tale has since inspired multiple films and documentaries, including The Angel Makers and the haunting, dialogue-free Hungarian feature film, Huckle. But long before their crimes reached the screen, they left an entire region soaked in quiet terror. While most of the poisonings took place in the otherwise unremarkable village of Nagyarev, similar deaths cropped up in neighboring towns like Tiszakurt, Okecke, Tiszafeldvár, Kunszent Márton, Mesterzalas, and Uxod. Rumors and suspicious whispers eventually reached the counties of Békés, Csongrád, and Zala. But for years, no one dared speak the truth out loud. Crimes. When Zuzanna Fazekas arrived in Nagyarev in 1911, she did so with secrets. Her husband had disappeared, without a trace, and without a satisfactory explanation. The whispers began immediately, but she paid them no mind. Zuzanna wasn't just a midwife. She was a force. Over the next decade, she was arrested 10 times for illegal abortions. But each time, she managed to walk free, acquitted, untouchable. She returned to her modest home and resumed her work as though nothing had happened. Because in the village, she wasn't afraid. She was trusted. She brought life into the world, and soon she would help take it out. Hungarian society at the time was deeply patriarchal. A young girl had no say in who she would marry. Her husband was chosen by her family, and that was that. There was no divorce, not even in cases of alcoholism, abuse, or outright cruelty. Women were trapped in domestic cages, silent and obedient. At least that's what the world believed. Then came the First World War. The able-bodied men of Nagyarev and the surrounding region left to fight for Austria-Hungary, and in their place came Allied prisoners of war, interned yet allowed to move through the village. Many of the women left to fend for themselves formed quiet liaisons with these foreign men. Love blossomed where loyalty had been expressed. But when the war ended and the husbands returned, tensions boiled over. Betrayal was in the air. Old patterns tried to return, but some women had tasted freedom, and they wouldn't go back. It was around this time that Fazekas began offering them an escape. Not legal advice, not marriage counseling, poison. She taught them how to extract arsenic from boiled flypaper. A little residue skimmed from the top, dried carefully, and then, just enough, added to a drink or meal, and she would ask them gently, why put up with them? The murders began with husbands, but it didn't stop there. Some women turned their attention to parents, burdensome and aging. Others poisoned lovers, children, even sons who stood in their way. The poison didn't discriminate, and soon, or neither did they. The first known poisoning in Nagyarev occurred in 1911, but it wasn't committed by Fazekas. Still, once she arrived, the frequency and boldness escalated. By the mid-1920s, the pattern was impossible to ignore, and yet still undetected by the law. Nagyarev had earned a nickname, a dark one, the Murder District. Over the course of 18 years, dozens of suspicious deaths occurred under Fazekas' shadow, and the bodies kept piling up. How did it all stay hidden? Simple. Fazekas was the closest thing to a doctor the village had, and her cousin, he was the man who filled out every death certificate. Capture, the fall of the angel makers, is as twisted as their rise, and to this day no one agrees on exactly how it happened. In one version, a visitor to Nagyarev fell ill after a meal and narrowly survived. Suspicions grew. One of the poisoners, a woman named Sabo, was caught in the act, trying to kill again. Under pressure, she cracked. She named another woman, Buenoano, who in turn pointed the finger directly at Fazekas. By the time authorities finally exhumed the graves, it was too late for justice to truly be served. Over 45 confirmed deaths, up to 300 suspected victims, and only 3 executions. Many of the women lived out their days behind bars. Some, remarkably, were never punished at all. Nagyarev went quiet again. The poisoners faded into folklore. And the villagers? They carried the weight of those secrets in silence. But the question still lingers, like the arsenic in their veins. How many more never got caught? How many more graves were never dug up? And what happens when evil isn't loud and monstrous, but quiet, smiling, and serving you tea? They weren't glamorous. They didn't wear veils or move in high society. They served tea, ran a boarding house, and buried their victims just a little too often. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins appeared to be simple Irish sisters living in Liverpool. But behind closed doors, they were something far more sinister. Black Widows. Arsenic was their weapon. Burial societies were their gold mine. And death was their business. In the damp alleys of 1880s Liverpool, 2 sisters quietly plotted a scheme so devious it would make even the Borgia family blush. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins were not strangers to hardship. They were Irish immigrants running a modest boarding house on Skirving Street. But as the death toll in their home began to rise, young, healthy people dying suddenly and leaving behind life insurance payouts, whispers began to spread. First, it was Catherine's son, John Flanagan, dead at 22 with $71 collected in insurance. Then Thomas Higgins' 8-year-old daughter, then 19-year-old Margaret Jennings, and finally Thomas Higgins himself, newly married to Margaret, insured with 5 different burial societies. All of them dead, all of them insured, and all of them under one roof. What seemed like tragedy was, in fact, a pattern, one soaked in arsenic and greed. It wasn't until Thomas Higgins' brother questioned the suspicious number of insurance policies and demanded an investigation that the house of death began to collapse. A coroner arrived in the middle of Higgins' wake, shocking mourners as an autopsy was performed, revealing arsenic in his organs. Catherine fled. Margaret was arrested. The house held more than grief. It held evidence. Bottles of white powder, pockets full of poison-laced dust, and soaked flypaper, all pointing to the same thing, murder. And when police exhumed the bodies of the previous victims, they all showed the telltale signs of arsenic poisoning. Their bodies are unnaturally well preserved. Their deaths, anything but natural. But it didn't end there. Catherine, in custody, claimed she wasn't alone. She named others. Women who allegedly helped kill for profit, conspired in fraud, even impersonated victims to cash in insurance. But her story kept changing. Allies became scapegoats. Enemies became ghosts. And in the end, her confessions were seen as too inconsistent to be trusted in court. Only she and Margaret were ever charged. In the shadowy tenements of 1880s Liverpool, 2 Irish sisters quietly ran into a humble boarding house. From the outside, Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins seemed ordinary, caretakers of a modest home on Skirving Street, But inside those walls, death came far too often, and always with a payout. The story began in 1880. The sisters, both unmarried, lived alongside a cast of lodgers, among them Catherine's adult son John, hod carrier Thomas Higgins and his young daughter Mary, and another lodger, Patrick Jennings, with his 19-year-old daughter Margaret. It was a crowded but typical working-class household, until people started dying. John Flanagan was the first. Just 22 years old and previously in good health, he suddenly fell ill and died in December 1880. No questions were raised. Catherine collected $71 from his burial society, a significant amount for a poor household, and life moved on. But something insidious had begun. 2 years later, Margaret Flanagan, who now began calling herself Margaret Higgins, married Thomas Higgins. Within months, 8-year-old Mary Higgins was dead. Again, the illness was sudden. Again, a burial society payout followed, this time to Margaret. Then in early 1883, Margaret Jennings, the teenage daughter of another lodger, died under similar circumstances. Once again, Catherine collected an insurance payout. That made 3 deaths sudden under one roof in less than 3 years, each one followed by a monetary reward. Still, no one asked too many questions. Poor neighborhoods were used to lose. Illness and death were frequent visitors. But even the streets of Liverpool had ears. Neighbors began to whisper, too many funerals, too many payouts. So the sisters moved, first to Latimer Street, then again to Ascot Street. But death followed them, or perhaps more accurately, they brought death with them. In September 1883, Thomas Higgins, now 45 and apparently in good health, suddenly fell ill. He complained of stomach pain so severe that a local doctor, Dr. Whitford, was called to examine him. The physician suspected dysentery from cheap whiskey and prescribed opium and castor oil. Within 2 days, Higgins was dead. Once again, the death was attributed to natural causes. But this time, someone questioned it. Patrick Higgins, Thomas's brother, didn't believe for a moment that his strong, healthy sibling could die from drinking poor liquor. When he learned that Thomas had been insured with not 1 but 5 different burial societies, he took his suspicions to the authorities. What happened next was both shocking and telling. During Higgins's wake, as mourners surrounded the body and whispered prayers, a coroner arrived to perform a post-mortem. The crowd fell silent. Catherine, upon hearing what was about to happen, fled the house. The autopsy was damning. Thomas Higgins had been poisoned, arsenic, administered over several days. His organs were saturated with it. The evidence didn't stop there. In the house, investigators discovered a suspicious white substance in a bottle and dust laced with arsenic in Margaret's apron pocket. The sisters had been clever, or so they thought, but not clever enough. Margaret Higgins was arrested immediately. Catherine, ever slippery, moved from boarding house to boarding house for nearly a week before finally being captured in Wavertree. Once in custody, the truth began to unravel, or rather explode. The police ordered the exhumation of the 3 previously deceased household members. The results were chilling. Each body was unusually well preserved, a telltale sign of arsenic poisoning. Traces of the deadly substance were found in all 3, John Flanagan, Mary Higgins, and Margaret Jennings. But one question haunted investigators. Where had the arsenic come from? At first, they assumed it had been obtained through rat poison, a common source of arsenic. But forensic tests revealed inconsistencies. The adulterants typically found in rat poison didn't match the samples in the victims' bodies. And then came the revelation: fly paper. In the 1880s, fly paper commonly contained arsenic. By soaking it in water, a solution could be extracted, one that was chemically identical to what had been found in the Higgins home. And fly paper was easy to acquire, even for poor, illiterate women. But the most stunning twist came when Catherine, trying to save herself, confessed that she and her sister weren't acting alone. She claimed they were just 2 players in a larger murder-for-profit conspiracy. She named names: Margaret Evans, Bridget Begley, Margaret Potter, Bridget Stanton, Mrs. Fallon, Catherine Ryan. Some were poisoners. Others provided insurance policies. One apparently acquired the arsenic itself. Catherine detailed how the ring had been operating for years, targeting vulnerable individuals, sometimes even impersonating victims to secure payouts. In one chilling account, an insurance agent visiting Thomas Higgins before issuing his policy was greeted by a man he believed to be Higgins, only to realize later it had been an imposter. But Catherine's story shifted constantly. She named conspirators, then withdrew accusations. She exonerated one woman after investigations began to suspect her. Her credibility collapsed. In the end, the only charges were brought against Catherine and Margaret for the murder of Thomas Higgins. At their 1884 trial, prosecutors painted a damning picture. They laid out the arsenic-laced deaths, the insurance fraud, and the pattern of profit. Catherine offered to testify against the others in exchange for leniency. The prosecution refused. Both sisters were found guilty. Both were sentenced to death. On March 3, 1884, at Kirkdale Prison, Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins were hanged side by side. Before their execution, a Roman Catholic priest attended to them. Over 1,000 people gathered to witness the hangings. The crowd that had once whispered suspicions now watched justice be served. Their wax figures were later added to Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors, immortalizing their place in the dark annals of British crime. And yet questions remain. Were they just two desperate women driven by poverty? Or key members of a far-reaching network of Black Widows killing for cash? The answer died with them on the scaffold. But their legacy remains. A chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous killers are not monsters hiding in shadows, but caretakers smiling across the dinner table. On March 3, 1884, Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins were led to the gallows at Kirkdale Prison. They were calm, dressed in black, accompanied by a priest. Outside the prison, a crowd of 1,000 people gathered to witness the execution of the so-called Black Widows of Liverpool. They were hung side by side, a final curtain call for a pair who had turned grief into profit and murder into routine. Although they were only convicted for the killing of Thomas Higgins, investigators believed there were more victims, and possibly more killers. Catherine's notes hinted at a larger conspiracy, a ring of women poisoning the vulnerable and profiting from their deaths. But no one else was ever convicted, and the whole truth died with them on the rope. Their story would haunt Victorian England for years, immortalized in headlines, books, and even wax figures at Madame Tussauds. Because in the end, Catherine and Margaret didn't just kill for money. They turned death into a business and trust into a trap. She didn't just want revenge. She wanted to poison an entire village. Ekaterini Dimitrievna's twisted story of hatred, parathion, and family betrayal shook Greece to its core and earned her a place in history as the last woman ever executed in the country. In the quiet hills of Nagyarev, Greece, nestled in the rugged landscape of Mani, lived a woman whose bitterness would soon turn into bloodshed. Ekaterini Dimitrievna, born into a poor rural family, seemed ordinary, quiet, reserved, even pitiful. A woman with a disability, divorced, financially struggling, and reportedly mistreated by those closest to her. But beneath the surface festered a cold fury. Starting in May 1962, she began methodically eliminating her own family, one poisoned plate at a time. Her mother, her cousin, her brother, even a 5-year-old child. And if her plan had gone undetected, she would have poisoned dozens more during a funeral, turning grief into mass murder. What drives a woman to such calculated cruelty? Was it years of abuse, a thirst for vengeance, or something far darker? In the sun-drenched hills of southern Greece, nestled within the rugged terrain of Mani, the quiet village of Nagyarev held a dark secret. A secret that began to unfold one spring morning in 1962. Not with a scream or a violent outburst, but with a plate of spaghetti. Ekaterini Dimitrievna, a 42-year-old woman known in her village for her withdrawn demeanor and a slight limp from hemiparesis, lived a life shrouded in bitterness. Estranged from her husband, living off welfare, and allegedly mistreated by her own family, she spent her days simmering in silence. To her neighbors, she was nothing more than a tired woman with bad luck. But behind her stoic face, a quiet hatred had been fermenting for years, one that would soon turn lethal. On May 27th, her 80-year-old mother, Stefula Lucaria, came to visit. It was an ordinary afternoon. Ekaterini, in a gesture that seemed warm and familial, offered her mother a plate of spaghetti. Moments after eating it, Stefula collapsed in agony, her body racked with convulsions, her face twisted in pain. She died quickly, and her death was attributed to a heart attack, consistent with her medical history. No suspicions were raised, no questions were asked, but someone should have been asking. Because 2 months later, on July 19th, it happened again. This time it was her cousin, Potula Tsilogonea. Ekaterini invited her over for coffee. Within minutes of sipping the drink, Petula fell to the ground in violent spasms. As she convulsed, her head struck the floor, causing a fatal skull fracture. Again, the cause of death seemed accidental, an unfortunate fall. The small village mourned quietly, never suspecting that the same woman stood at the center of both tragedies. But the poisoner wasn't finished. Days later, she turned her attention to her brother, Konstantinos. She invited him over for coffee as well, and shortly after, he began vomiting and collapsed in the street. He survived, barely, after receiving emergency treatment. He had no idea what had just happened to him. Grateful to be alive, he accepted another invitation from his sister on August 6th for what would be his last meal. She served him eggs, once again laced with parathion, a deadly agricultural insecticide. This time he didn't make it. His death, like the others, was blamed on natural causes. A heart attack, the coroner wrote, complicated by gallbladder issues. And once again, nobody looked deeper. But it was her final victim that would expose the entire nightmare. September 6th, a bright, innocent 5-year-old boy named Elias Pitsula, her nephew, wandered into her home. Ekaterini offered him a treat, a Turkish delight, sweet and innocent looking. Moments later, Elias began foaming at the mouth. His small body seized violently. He died en route to the hospital, and this time, something didn't feel right. A full autopsy revealed high levels of parathion in the child's stomach. Authorities were stunned. The other 3 family members were exhumed and tested, and all of them showed signs of the same poison. Suddenly, the heart attacks, accidental falls, and natural deaths no longer seemed so innocent. 4 days after Elias' death, Ekaterini walked into the mayor's office and confessed to everything. But the truth she told was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. She claimed she hadn't just wanted revenge, she had planned to poison the entire village. Her targets weren't only her abusive family members, but neighbors, children, innocent people. She had saved her most audacious plan for her brother's funeral, where she intended to lace the food and drinks with parathion and kill en masse. In her words, she was getting even with a village that had always looked down on her. Her stash of parathion and mercury, her original poison of choice, was found buried near her home. She admitted she had even tried to poison her sister-in-law and a young niece, but failed when they refused her offers of pomegranates. This wasn't madness born in a moment. It was a slow, calculated mission of annihilation. Demetria was arrested at a church, surrounded by villagers who had once pitied her. But now they wanted justice. Authorities quickly moved her to a high-security prison in Kalamata, fearing a lynching from outraged locals. Her confessions shocked the country. Headlines labeled her the hyena of hell. International papers covered the story. Could someone so ordinary, so overlooked, really harbor this level of venom? A psychiatric evaluation determined she had below-average intelligence and likely suffered neurological issues, but she was found sane and fully responsible for her actions. Investigators believed her motive wasn't just revenge, it was greed. By killing her mother, she would inherit the family home. The rest, they argued, was part of an elaborate ploy to feign insanity and escape the death penalty. On May 8, 1963, the verdict was in, guilty on 4 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted manslaughter. She received 4 death sentences and an additional 15 years in prison. All appeals were denied. At dawn on April 10, 1965, in a quiet military range in Goudi, Athens, Ekaterini Demetria stood before a firing squad. She did not cry. She did not scream. And just like that, with the echo of bullets and the smell of gunpowder, she became the last woman to be executed in Greece. Her legacy? A poisoned trail of silence, revenge, and horror. A haunting reminder that the most dangerous people aren't always the loudest. They're the ones we ignore. Ekaterini Demetria's story ends not with remorse, but with a rifle's crack. In April 1965, after multiple death sentences and failed appeals, she stood before a firing squad, executed at dawn in Goudi, becoming the last woman ever executed in Greece. Her house of death left behind more than poisoned corpses. It left a village haunted by betrayal, a nation stunned by her icy confession, and generations still asking one simple, horrifying question: how far can quiet hatred go before it turns deadly? She poisoned her husband, then her son, then tried to blow up her boyfriend. And for over a decade, no one suspected a thing. Judy Buenoano was charming, calculating, and deadly. A black widow hiding behind motherhood and ambition. But the trail of bodies she left behind would eventually catch up to her, in a courtroom, and finally, on Florida's electric chair. Born into cruelty and forged in trauma, Judy Buenoano's life was shaped by violence long before she ever took a life herself. Raised in a household of abuse, she learned early how to manipulate pain and how to hide her rage. By the time she was a young mother, Judy had already served time for attacking her own family. But what followed was a decades-long series of cold, calculated killings, disguised as tragedy, masked as misfortune. She killed for money, she killed for control, and somehow she always managed to slip under the radar. Her victims included her husband, her disabled son, 2 boyfriends, and nearly a third. And each time, she walked away richer, until the truth exploded into public view. Literally. This is the chilling story of Judy Buenoano, one of America's most terrifying female serial killers. Judias Analu Buenoano had many names. Judias Welty, Judias Goodyear, Judias Morris, but by the time the world knew her real name, it was already too late for the people closest to her. Born in the dusty Texas town of Quanah in 1943, Judy's life began with tragedy. Her mother died when she was just 4 years old, and she and her younger brother were soon sent to live with their grandparents. But when their father remarried, the children were brought back into a deeply troubled home, one marred by abuse, cruelty, and starvation. Judy, barely a teenager, snapped. She attacked her father and her stepfamily with hot grease. The court sentenced her to 2 months in prison. Upon release, she chose to go to reform school. And when she emerged, she carried with her a new weapon: discipline. She trained as a nursing assistant. On the surface, Judy was turning her life around. But beneath the uniform and forced smiles, something dark festered. A hunger for control, a cold, methodical willingness to destroy anyone who stood in her way. She had her first child, Michael, in 1961. Though she raised him, she resented him. He was born out of wedlock and in her eyes was a living reminder of a life she wanted to erase. In 1971, she married James Goodyear, a sergeant in the United States Air Force. To everyone else, James was a dedicated husband and father. But to Judy, he was worth more dead than alive. Just months after returning from deployment, James suddenly fell ill and died. The cause? Listed as natural. Judy collected the life insurance money and moved on without a whisper of suspicion. 2 years later, she was living with another man, Bobby Joe Morris, in Colorado. And just like before, Bobby Joe died suddenly. Again, no alarm was raised. Another man gone. Another payout in Judy's pocket. But it didn't stop there. 1980, Judy took her disabled son, Michael, now a paraplegic due to unexplained illness, out on a canoeing trip in Milton, Florida. Michael wore heavy leg and arm braces. He couldn't swim. He wasn't even wearing a life jacket. The canoe capsized. Michael drowned in the dark waters, unable to fight for his life. His death was ruled an accident. Judy used the insurance money to open a beauty salon, but her thirst for control and wealth wasn't quenched. In 1983, she was dating John Gentry, a successful businessman from Pensacola. He thought she was his loving partner. In reality, she was slowly poisoning him with arsenic, hidden in the vitamin pills she insisted he take every day. When that wasn't fast enough, she rigged his car to explode. The blast didn't kill him. It only wounded him. But that one act would unravel her entire web of death. As Gentry recovered in the hospital, detectives began digging. They discovered Judy had been telling friends that Gentry was dying of a terminal illness months before the explosion. They found inconsistencies in her background, and soon they uncovered a trail of insurance policies, mysterious illnesses, and sudden deaths. Authorities exhumed the bodies of James Goodyear, Bobby Joe Morris, and even Michael. The findings were chilling. Each man had been poisoned with arsenic. Slowly, painfully, silently. She was arrested later that year. In 1984, Judy was convicted for the murder of her son and the attempted murder of John Gentry. In 1985, she was sentenced to death for the murder of her husband, James Goodyear. As investigators looked deeper, more bodies surfaced, more suspicious deaths, more boyfriends, more possible victims. Some say the final count will never be known. She spent over a decade on death row at Broward Correctional Institution. And on the morning of March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano was strapped into the electric chair at Florida State Prison. She was the first woman executed in Florida in 150 years, and the first woman electrocuted in the United States since 1976. Her last meal was modest: broccoli, asparagus, tomato wedges, strawberries, and hot tea with lemon. When asked if she had any final words, she simply said, "No, sir," and just like that, her silence sealed the end of one of the most chilling female serial killers in American history. She played the part of the grieving widow, the devoted mother, the supportive girlfriend, but behind it all was a woman who believed that love was expendable, trust was a weakness, and murder was just another means to a better life. Judy Buenoano wanted it all: the money, the power, the freedom, and she was willing to kill anyone in her way to get it. But behind every sudden illness and tragic accident was a pattern. And in the end, that pattern cost her everything. When the final switch was flipped on March 30th, 1998, it didn't just end her life. It ended one of the most overlooked reigns of terror in American true crime history. She was the first woman electrocuted in Florida in 150 years. And her story is a haunting reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous killers wear the mask of a caregiver. She was paid to save them, but one by one they vanished into the soil. When the truth was unearthed, it wasn't just shocking, it was incomprehensible. 33 babies, no mercy, no remorse, and a woman history nearly forgot. In 18th century Portugal, when foundling wheels offered abandoned children a second chance at life, one woman turned that hope into horror. Luisa de Jesus, a seemingly unremarkable delivery worker, exploited the kindness of a broken system. Not for survival, but for money soaked in blood. She wasn't a monster who wore her evil on her face. She was quiet, poor, unassuming, but behind her eyes was a scheme so gruesome it would become one of the most disturbing killing sprees in European history. Between coins and cradles, Luisa spun a web of murder. And by the time her hands were finally stopped, dozens of innocent lives had already been extinguished. Her crime wasn't born from passion or rage. It was born from greed, cold, calculated, and silent as a lullaby. This is the forgotten tale of Portugal's youngest and deadliest female serial killer, and the babies who never got a chance to speak. In the sleepy village of Figueira de Lourvão, nestled within the rugged hills of 18th century Portugal, a baby girl named Luisa was born on December 10th, 1748. Her birth passed without ceremony, just another child to peasant farmers Manuel and Mariana Rodriguez, themselves first cousins. The Portugal of her childhood was deeply religious, hierarchical, and poor. And though many children grew up in hardship, Luisa's life would spiral into a darkness unlike any other. By adulthood, Luisa was a married woman making ends meet as a courier, transporting goods between small rural towns in the city of Coimbra. She was neither rich nor remarkable in appearance, but beneath her plain exterior lay something far more sinister, a mind capable of exploiting one of society's most fragile systems: the foundling wheel. The foundling wheel, a rotating wooden cylinder installed in the walls of convents or orphanages, was a symbol of hope for desperate mothers. With a simple turn of the wheel, they could anonymously leave their unwanted newborns in the care of the church, and maybe, just maybe, give them a chance at life. The state even provided small incentives for those who adopted these children: a modest cash stipend, a cradle, and some cotton cloth. But to Luisa de Jesus, this wasn't charity, it was opportunity. What began as one adoption became 2, then 3, then more. Over time, she would adopt 34 infants. Her cover was almost perfect. Sometimes she used her real name, sometimes she used others, disguising her intent under the pretense of delivery work. After receiving the state's subsidy, Luisa never intended to care for the children. Instead, she took them home, smothered or strangled them, and then discarded their bodies like trash. Some she buried beneath her floorboards. Others she took to Monte Arroyo, just beyond the walls of the city, where she dug shallow graves and pressed their tiny corpses into the dirt. In at least one instance, she stuffed a baby into a clay pot. The murders were quiet, methodical, and heartless, her victims unable to cry out, to beg, or to be remembered. And for a time, no one noticed. The foundling wheel system was deeply flawed, underfunded, overcrowded, and careless. Workers barely kept track of where the babies went. Luisa moved through the loopholes with ease, until April 1st, 1772. On that day, Angelica Maria, a worker at the Coimbra Foundling House, was walking near Monte Arroyo when she stumbled upon a disturbed patch of soil. Curious, she dug with her hands and unearthed the tiny, lifeless body of a child. Around the baby's neck were unmistakable signs of strangulation. Authorities launched an immediate investigation. Adoption records traced the child back to Luisa de Jesus. When questioned, she admitted to having murdered not one, but 2 children on April 6th, just days earlier. But that was only the beginning. A search of her home revealed a horror show. 18 infant bodies buried beneath her floors. Another 13 were found in the same shallow graves near Monte Arroyo, bringing the known total to 33 dead children. Authorities were horrified. Some of the corpses had deteriorated beyond recognition, limbs twisted or missing, skulls separated from torsos. But investigators determined decomposition, not dismemberment, was the cause. The question was now undeniable. Who had been keeping track of this woman's adoptions? How could she have taken 34 children without setting off alarms? She was charged with 33 counts of murder. 1 child remained unaccounted for, and Luisa refused to speak about what happened to it. 2 workers from the foundling wheel were also arrested for negligence but were eventually released. 1 man, a high-ranking legal clerk named Pascual Luis Ferreira da Silva, had formally processed all 34 adoptions to Luisa. His complicity, whether out of ignorance or greed, was never proven. Her defense tried to invoke the law. She was under 25, they claimed, legally a minor and therefore ineligible for the death penalty. But the judges, led by the stern and infamous Pina Monique, scoffed. If she was old enough to murder 33 helpless infants in cold blood, she was old enough to hang. The court sentenced her to death, ordering her to repay the 20,000 reais she had collected. But death would not come quietly for Luisa. On July 1st, 1772, the city of Coimbra bore witness to one of the most gruesome public executions in its history. Luisa was marched through the streets, a thick rope tied around her neck. A magistrate followed close behind, reading her crimes aloud to a crowd that had gathered, not out of sympathy, but of revulsion. Then came the punishment. Her hands were chopped off. Her flesh was seared with red-hot iron. Finally, as her bloodied body slumped forward, she was garroted, choked to death by a tightening noose around her throat. Her body was thrown into the flames, her ashes scattered. Luisa de Jesus, the woman who murdered babies for pocket change, became the last woman ever executed in Portugal. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is not just in her crimes, but in how long it took to notice them. For every shallow grave unearthed, one question remains buried in silence. How many others like her slipped through the cracks of a broken system? On July 1st, 1772, the town of Coimbra watched in stunned silence as Luisa de Jesus was marched through the streets, her crimes echoing through the magistrate's voice. Her punishment was severe: public humiliation, torture, and finally, execution. But no punishment could match the weight of the lives she took. In the ashes of her execution, the state tried to cleanse itself of the horror she left behind. But the scars remain. 33 children, nameless to many, voiceless in life, buried in shallow graves or hidden in clay pots, were betrayed by the very system that promised them safety. And one woman, for the price of a few rays and a piece of cotton, made them disappear. Luisa de Jesus wasn't just a killer. She was a betrayal of motherhood, of humanity, of mercy. And her story remains a chilling reminder of what happens when compassion becomes currency. She was a noble woman with a delicate smile and a deadly obsession. Before the affair of the poisons shocked the court of Louis XIV, before names like La Voisin or Madame de Montespan were whispered in fear, there was her, the elegant aristocrat who allegedly tested poisons on the dying, murdered her own family, and kept it all hidden in love letters. This is the chilling story of the Marquise de Bramvilliers. Paris, 17th century, a city cloaked in lace, power, and secrets. In the candlelit salons of aristocrats, rumors swirled about whispers of sorcery, poisons, and mysterious deaths. But few suspected that one of the most dangerous killers among them wasn't a man lurking in alleyways. It was a woman of status, grace, and lethal precision. Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, the Marquise de Bramvilliers, was born into privilege, daughter of a powerful judge, wife to a wealthy nobleman. But behind her refined upbringing was a woman obsessed with control, vengeance, and toxic revenge. As her debts mounted and her desires spiraled, her servants began to fall ill. Then her father, then her brothers, all dead, all conveniently timed. And yet for years no one suspected a thing, until one unlocked box and a corpse reeking of secrets changed everything. In the glittering courts of 17th century France, a storm was quietly brewing behind the golden tapestries and polished silver. A noblewoman, draped in silk and perfume, moved through salons and cathedrals with the poise of aristocracy and the mind of a murderer. Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, the Marquise de Bramvilliers, was born into wealth, status, and influence. Her father was a powerful magistrate in Paris. Her dowry alone was enough to secure a small fortune. But beneath her polished smile was a woman scorned by patriarchy, driven by greed, lust, and revenge. And soon she would become one of the most feared names in France. It all began with a love affair. Her husband, the Marquis, was careless and distracted, a gambler with no head for business. But Sainte-Croix, a charming officer and alchemist, captured her attention and her heart. The two became lovers, bound not just by passion, but by poison. Sainte-Croix was arrested by the order of her own father for sullying the family name. But while locked in the Bastille, he met Exili, a man who whispered the secrets of deadly potions in exchange for stories and coin. By the time he was released, Sainte-Croix was no longer just a suitor. He was a poisoner. With his help, the Marquise began to test her concoctions. First, they say, on the sick and dying in the hospitals of Paris. Then, on her own servants. No one suspected a thing, until one day she set her sights on a greater prize. Her father's fortune. Her father, Antoine d'Aubray, began to fall mysteriously ill. Her presence at his side was constant, her concern performative. In reality, she was slipping him doses of a lethal cocktail nicknamed Glazer's Recipe. When he died, the autopsy suggested gout. But it was murder, and it didn't stop there. With her inheritance quickly evaporating, she turned her attention to her brothers. They were young, strong, and standing between her and the remaining fortune. She planted a loyal servant, La Chaussée, in their home. Soon after an Easter dinner, one brother fell violently ill. Then the second. Both died. Again, autopsies suggested malignant humors. But behind closed doors, whispers were growing. The web unraveled in 1672, when Sainte-Croix was found dead in his laboratory, allegedly poisoned by his own work. Among his belongings was a locked box. Inside, vials of poison, a letter of debt to the Marquise, and most damning of all, letters detailing their plots in her own handwriting. La Chaussée panicked. He fled. Authorities pursued. Under torture, he confessed everything. The Marquise ran, slipping into England, then hiding in Belgium under assumed names. But fate, and the long arm of the French crown, caught up with her in a convent in Liège. Her belongings revealed a confession. She had poisoned her father, 2 brothers, and attempted to kill her sister, daughter, and husband. She admitted to multiple affairs and that several of her children were illegitimate. When brought back to Paris, the trial captivated the city. Her noble status made it all the more scandalous. Aristocrats packed the courtroom. Madame de Sévigné wrote vividly of the case in letters that still survive today. Despite her desperate denials, the evidence was damning. Torture wrung out a final confession. She was sentenced to death. On July 16, 1676, the Marquise was paraded through Paris, clad in a white chemise, her hair shaved, her body battered from the brutal water cure. Her execution was public, final, and dramatic. The Place de Grève teemed with spectators. Her head was struck clean off. Her body was burned, her ashes scattered to the wind. But the story didn't end there. Her case triggered a wildfire, the affair of the poisons. Nobles, mistresses, alchemists, and priests were suddenly suspects. Even Madame de Montespan, mistress to King Louis XII, was implicated. What started as one woman's vengeance became a reckoning for the entire court. Centuries later, the Marquise lives on, not in stone, but in song, story, and opera. From the pages of Alexandre Dumas to the stanzas of Robert Browning, her legend lingers like the scent of arsenic in a velvet glove. A lady of Paris, a daughter of nobility, a mother, a murderer, and perhaps the most infamous poisoner in French history. 1676, she marched in silence through the heart of Paris. Wearing a simple white gown, her hair shorn, her eyes hollow, the condemned Marquise made her way to the Place de Grève. As the blade fur in her body burned, the ashes of her crimes scattered into the same air once filled with powdered perfume and noble chatter. But her death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much darker chapter, the affair of the poisons, a scandal that would entangle kings, mistresses, witches, and nobles in a web of murder, black mass, and betrayal. And at the center of that spark was a woman with a vial in her hand and revenge in her heart. This was the story of Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, the Marquise de Bramvilliers, refined, ruthless, and unforgettable. She craved love. She longed for escape. But what she found was Raymond Fernandez. And together, they became something far more dangerous than either could have been alone. She posed as his sister, smiled at their victims, and helped lure them in. But when jealousy flared, she didn't just watch him kill, she joined him. This is the chilling story of Martha Beck, a woman whose search for love turned into a trail of death. Born Martha Jewel Seabrook in 1920, her life was shadowed by pain from the very beginning. Obesity, early puberty, and, according to her own words, sexual abuse at the hands of her brother, followed by her mother's cold violence. By the time she was a teenager, Martha had already learned that love came with pain, and that survival meant escaping into fantasy. Romance novels, love stories on the screen, and later, a lonely heart's ad, the kind printed in the back of newspapers, where desperate souls search for affection. That ad led her to Raymond Fernandez, a con man with charm, cruelty, and a dark secret. He seduced and scammed women for a living. But when he met Martha, something changed. She didn't just want him, she wanted all of him, and she was willing to give up everything, even her own children, to have him. She posed as his sister, cooked for his victims, smiled and comforted them before their deaths. And when her jealousy took over, she picked up a hammer and helped end lives with her own hands. In 1949, they murdered 3 people, including a young mother and her 2-year-old child. Their spree was short but brutal. Their arrest? A quiet knock at the door in a Michigan suburb. What followed was a media frenzy and a double death sentence that would see them both executed at Sing Sing just 2 years later. Martha Beck was born Martha Jewel Seabrook on May 6, 1920, in the small town of Milton, Florida. From the beginning, life was unkind to her. She was overweight due to what was then described as a glandular issue, a common explanation for obesity at the time, and experienced puberty earlier than most children. Her physical appearance made her the subject of ridicule, and the emotional scars she carried went far deeper than the ones on the surface. Martha's childhood, according to her own claims during her trial, was marked by trauma. She alleged that she was raped by her brother and then beaten by her mother after revealing the assault. This was a girl who learned early on that trust could be deadly and love could come with violence. Her attempts to escape this torment were clumsy. One story suggests that as a teenager, she ran away to an uncle's house, bringing along a young Truman Capote, then only 10 years old. But whether true or a distorted memory, it captures a defining truth of Martha Beck's early life. She longed to be seen, to be chosen, and to be loved. After finishing school, Martha studied nursing, but struggled to find work. Her weight and appearance were social barriers in a judgmental world. Eventually, she found a job preparing female bodies for burial as an undertaker's assistant. It was short-lived. She left that job and moved to California, seeking a fresh start. There, she worked at a U.S. Army hospital, but instead of healing her wounds, California gave her more. She became pregnant. The man responsible refused to marry her. Alone and carrying a child at a time when unmarried mothers were shunned by society, Martha returned to Florida and told everyone that the father of her baby had died a war hero in the Pacific Campaign. The local paper even published the story. She played the grieving widow, a mask she would wear more than once in her life. Soon after, she became pregnant again, this time by a bus driver named Alfred Beck. They married, but the union was short-lived, ending in divorce after just 6 months. She now had 2 children, no husband, and no future in sight. With no job and the crushing responsibility of 2 mouths to feed, Martha began to escape into the only place she could control: fantasy, romance novels, love stories, glossy magazines filled with promises of passion and fate. Then in 1946, she found employment at the Pensacola Hospital for Children. It gave her a sense of purpose, but not happiness. In 1947, she placed a Lonely Hearts ad in the hopes of finding true love. What she got instead was Corazon. Raymond Fernandez. Fernandez was everything Martha thought she wanted. He was exotic, mysterious, and charismatic. But beneath the surface, he was a predator. A con man who used Lonely Hearts ads to find and exploit vulnerable women for money. Still, when Martha met him, she believed he was her one true love. Fernandez visited her in Florida, and after a brief stay, returned to New York. Martha told everyone they were engaged. But when she was abruptly fired from her job, she made a drastic decision. She packed up her things, left her children behind, and traveled to New York to be with him. To Fernandez, that act alone proved her loyalty. She had abandoned her entire life for him. He confessed his criminal activities, expecting her to recoil. But instead, she embraced him. And soon the children were out of the picture completely. She sent them to the Salvation Army so she could give herself fully to Fernandez, with no distractions. They began working as a team. To gain victims' trust, Martha posed as Raymond's sister, creating the illusion of domestic normalcy. Women who might have been suspicious were reassured by the presence of another woman. Sometimes Martha posed as the homeowner, while Raymond was just a visiting sibling. The manipulation was seamless. But behind the polite smiles and household games, jealousy burned in Martha like a fire she couldn't put out. She was possessive, violent, and consumed by rage whenever Raymond showed affection to another woman. Even though their con relied on seduction, Martha couldn't bear to see him with anyone else. If he had sex with a victim, Martha's fury would explode. Sometimes directed at him, sometimes at the women. And when she snapped, things turned deadly. In 1949, the couple committed 3 murders that would seal their fates. One of their victims was Janet Fay, a 66-year-old woman from Long Island who believed she was about to be married. But when Martha found Janet in bed with Raymond, her jealousy took over. She hit Janet in the head with a hammer. Fernandez, calm as ever, finished the job by strangling her. They buried her body in a trunk and fled before authorities could investigate. Their next and final stop was Wyoming Township, Michigan, a quiet suburb near Grand Rapids. There they met Delphine Downing, 28-year-old widow with a 2-year-old daughter. The couple stayed with her, claiming to be siblings. As they settled into the house, tensions began to rise. On February 28th, Delphine became uneasy and distressed. Raymond gave her sleeping pills to calm her down, but then her toddler started to cry. The sound echoed through the house like a warning bell. Martha Beck snapped again. She strangled the child in a fit of rage but did not kill her. Concerned Delphine would wake up and see the child bruised, Raymond shot the unconscious woman in the head. And then they stayed. They lingered in that house for days, sleeping, eating, living, surrounded by the smell of death and the whimpers of a terrified child. When the girl cried again, Martha drowned her in a basin of water. They buried both bodies in the basement, but neighbors had already noticed something was wrong. On March 1st, 1949, the police knocked on the door, and what they found ended the killing spree for good. Trial and executions, Raymond Fernandez confessed almost immediately, but soon after he tried to retract his statement, claiming he only confessed to protect Martha. The pair denied responsibility for the 17 murders law enforcement suspected them of. Ultimately, they were only tried for the murder of Janet Fay, the most straightforward case, and one guaranteed to carry the death penalty in New York. They were convicted and sentenced to death by electric chair. On March 8, 1951, at Sing Sing Prison, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez sat side by side for the final time. Despite their bloody legacy, Martha clung to the fantasy even in death, that what they had was real love. She died believing her story was one of romance, sacrifice, and passion. The world remembers it differently. A woman who abandoned her children, who traded fantasy for fury, and who became one half of one of America's most twisted and tragic duos. Martha Beck's last chapter wasn't read from a romance novel. It was written in the headlines, screamed across courtrooms, and ended up in a cold electric chair. To the world, she was a monster in love. To Raymond Fernandez, she was proof of devotion. To her victims, she was the woman who smiled. Just before the lights went out, they never stood trial for all the murders they were suspected of, 17 in total. Only Janet Fay's death led to her sentence. But their legacy lingers, the tale of 2 lonely hearts who found each other and destroyed everything in their path. Because sometimes the scariest love stories are the ones that end in blood. She poisoned her daughter, then her husband, and finally, her best friend's wife, all for a man who never loved her back. But what made Marianne Britland Britain's deadliest neighbor wasn't just the murders, it was how calmly she kept living among her victims. This is the chilling story of the first woman to be hanged at Strangeways Prison. Marianne Britland didn't look like a killer. A factory worker by day, a barmaid by night, and a mother of two. To her neighbors in Ashton-under-Lyne, she was just another hard-working woman, struggling to make ends meet in a tough northern town. But in early 1886, something shifted. A forbidden love took root, an affair with the man across the street, and Mary began to believe she could rewrite her life. All she needed was a little poison, and no witnesses. In just 3 months, 3 people would die, including her own daughter, all victims of strychnine, masked as mouse powder. And the motive? Love? Or something darker? This is the twisted story of Marianne Britland. Marianne Britland looked like an ordinary woman, a factory worker by day, a barmaid by night, and a mother of 2 daughters. She lived a modest life in Ashton-under-Lyne with her husband Thomas and their 2 girls in a small rented house on Turner Lane. But behind the tired eyes and quiet routines, Marianne was hiding something dark, something lethal. In early 1886, Mary walked into a local chemist shop with a simple request. She needed to get rid of mice. The chemist handed her several packets of Harrison's vermin killer, a powerful poison made with arsenic and strychnine. She signed the poison register, as required by law. It seemed harmless enough, just another working-class woman dealing with pests. But Mary wasn't battling rodents. She was laying the groundwork for murder. Just weeks later, her 19-year-old daughter Elizabeth, once healthy and full of life, fell violently ill. The doctor who arrived couldn't explain it, but he didn't suspect foul play. He ruled it natural causes. Grieving, Mary claimed $10 from her daughter's life insurance, a modest payout at best. Then came Thomas Britland, Mary's husband. On May 3rd, he too was struck down by sudden illness. The cause? The doctor believed it was epilepsy. Another death, another insurance claim. No one raised an eyebrow, but something was shifting beneath the surface. What nobody knew yet was that Mary had fallen in love, not with her husband, not even with a stranger, but with her neighbor, Thomas Dixon, a married man who lived just across the street. When Thomas Dixon's wife, Mary, extended her kindness and invited the newly widowed Marianne to stay in their home, she unknowingly signed her own death warrant. On May 14th, less than 2 weeks after Thomas Britland's death, Mary Dixon died in agony. Her symptoms matched the others: sudden spasms, convulsions, unbearable pain. This time, suspicion finally took hold. 3 deaths, all with nearly identical symptoms, all insured, all connected to the same woman. An investigation was launched. Mary Dixon's body was exhumed, and what the pathologist discovered shattered the quiet town of Ashton-under-Lyne. Lethal quantities of both strychnine and arsenic. And it didn't take long for the trail to lead right back to Marianne Britland. She was arrested along with her lover, Thomas Dixon. In custody, Marianne confessed. She told police she had wanted to marry Dixon, that Elizabeth, her own daughter, had suspected something. So she silenced her. Then she eliminated her husband. And finally, the one woman standing in the way of her twisted dream life, Mary Dixon. But when it came time to stand trial, Mary tried to walk it back. She claimed she was innocent, that she hadn't benefited from the deaths, that the insurance money, small sums in total, was hardly a motive. But it was too late. The jury didn't buy her performance. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses recalled her asking disturbing questions about poison, about how it worked, and more importantly, how long it could be detected after death. She'd spoken too freely, too often. In July of 1886, Marianne Britland was convicted of murder. On August 9th, she became the first woman to be executed at Manchester's Strangeways Prison. But her final moments were far from stoic. On the morning of her hanging, Mary collapsed. Terrified and sobbing, she begged for mercy. She had to be physically held up by 2 female wardens as the noose was secured. The executioner, James Barry, gave the signal. The wardens stepped back. The trapdoor opened, and Marianne Britland dropped into the pages of history. Not as a grieving mother or a wronged wife, but as Britain's quietest serial killer. The kind of killer who hides in plain sight, the kind who smiles as she serves drinks, and slowly poisons those closest to her. Marianne Britland was the first woman ever hanged at Strangeways Prison, but she wouldn't be the last. In death, she became a symbol, not of passion, but of cold calculation. A woman who thought no one would notice the pattern until it was too late. In the end, it wasn't love that doomed her. It was the lie she told herself that no one would ever suspect a woman. Thanks for watching. If this story left you chilled, make sure to subscribe for more true crime tales you've never heard before. But won't forget, she buried husbands, children, and lovers, all while collecting their insurance money. But it wasn't grief she wore. It was arsenic under her fingernails. By the time the law caught up with Marianne Cotton, death surrounded her like perfume. And the body count? Chilling. England in the 1800s was a hard place to survive. Disease was rampant, poverty unforgiving, and death far too familiar. But even in such grim times, few could match the darkness of Marianne Cotton. A woman who didn't just endure loss, she manufactured it. Over 2 decades, husbands, lovers, children, even her own mother, all died mysteriously, often after suffering agonizing stomach pains. They called it gastric fever. But what they didn't see, what Marianne never stopped administering, was poison. Her tool of choice? Arsenic. Odorless, tasteless, and perfectly legal in Victorian England. Marianne Cotton wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a predator in mourning clothes. And with every death, she gained something. Money, freedom, or simply the removal of someone in her way. To the people of County Durham, Marianne Cotton was the picture of an ordinary Englishwoman. Dressed modestly, a mother, a caretaker, someone who moved often, always with a tragic story and a fresh start. But behind every new home was a funeral, and behind every death, a payout. It started with love, or what passed for it. Marianne Robson was born into a working-class family in 1832. Her father died when she was just 9, falling into a coal shaft. That tragedy set the tone for a life steeped in hardship, loss, and survival at all costs. By 20, she was married to a man named William Mowbray. He was the first to die. So were their children, one after another, gone to gastric fever. Marianne cried, collected the life insurance, and moved on. Then came George Ward. Another husband, another slow illness, paralysis, stomach pain, fever. The doctor was surprised at how fast George slipped away. Marianne wasn't. She signed the paperwork, collected the money, left town. Next was James Robinson, a grieving widower. Marianne stepped in as housekeeper, then as wife, but soon his baby was dead, then his children, then Marianne's daughter, and then she insisted James take out a life insurance policy on himself. That's when he stopped listening to her and started watching. When Robinson uncovered her theft, debt, and manipulation, he threw her out. By then, Marianne had left behind 5 dead children and 2 dead husbands, with no suspicion, no charges, just a reputation for bad luck. She wasn't done. Her next target was Frederick Cotton, a widower introduced by a friend. He came with 2 sons and a modest home. Within months, that friend, his sister, was dead, and Marianne had moved in, then married Frederick bigamously, then got pregnant by another man entirely. Then the killing resumed. Frederick died of gastric fever. His life had been insured. His son died next. Then the baby. Then Marianne's lover, Joseph Natras, just after changing his will to leave her everything. She was surrounded by death, but no one dared connect the dots. Not yet. That would change with the boy she couldn't get rid of, Charles Edward Cotton. He was the last of the Cotton children, and Marianne wanted him gone. When she asked a parish official to send him to the workhouse, her words were chilling. "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest of the Cottons." 5 days later, Charles was dead. But this time, Marianne made a mistake. Her first visit wasn't to a doctor, it was to the insurance office. No death certificate, no money, and suddenly, a lot of questions. Charles's body was exhumed. The test confirmed it. Arsenic. By the time she stood trial in 1873, the press had pieced it together, at least 21 deaths. Husbands, lovers, her mother, children, all dead, all insured, all with symptoms of poisoning. Mary Ann claimed innocence, blamed typhus, wallpaper dyes, mistaken chemists, but the jury took just 90 minutes to convict her. She didn't go quietly. At Durham jail, she begged for mercy, expecting royal clemency. It never came. On March 24, 1873, she was hanged, but not cleanly. The rope was rigged too short. Whether by accident or design, it didn't snap her neck. She died slowly, strangled. Only 2 of her 13 children survived her. One of them, born in prison, would grow up with the shadow of Mary Ann Cotton, Britain's first known female serial killer, hanging over her name. When Mary Ann Cotton finally stood trial in 1873, the court only charged her with one murder, that of her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. But behind her were at least 21 other suspicious deaths, family, lovers, and children, each one hauntingly similar. And while the jury needed only 90 minutes to find her guilty, the truth is, her guilt had been festering for years, quietly, patiently. With every funeral, she walked away richer, and with every life lost, she grew colder. Her execution was as grim as her crimes. The rope was set too short. She didn't die instantly. Instead, the woman who had strangled so many with silence and arsenic was herself strangled by a rope, slowly, painfully. Mary Ann Cotton's legacy is not just one of murder, it's a reminder. Evil doesn't always come with a knife or a scream. Sometimes it smiles, nurses you back to health, and stirs arsenic into your tea. She was a grandmother, a nurse, a caretaker, a woman of God, but behind the kind smile was a killer. Her victims trusted her with their lives, and she watched them die, one by one. She served them poison and warm tea, then prayed beside their hospital beds. This is the chilling story of Velma Barfield, America's first woman executed by lethal injection, and the grandmother next door you never saw coming. Velma Barfield looked like someone's sweet aunt, a soft-spoken Southern woman from North Carolina who offered her care and presence to those who were ill, elderly, or lonely. But beneath the polite manners and Christian devotion was a woman hiding a deadly secret, a trail of bodies all tied together by a silent killer. Arsenic. Her journey started in hardship, a violent father, a painful hysterectomy, a descent into addiction. But somewhere along the way, Velma's pain turned into murderous intent. It started with her first husband, burned alive in their home while she was out. Then her second husband, gone from heart complications, they said. Next came her own mother, then elderly patients, and even a boyfriend who suspected too much. Each death is eerily similar. Vomiting, convulsions, then silence. To the outside world, she was grieving, even helpful. But behind closed doors, Velma was methodically eliminating anyone who got in her way. And when the truth finally surfaced, it shocked a nation. Not just because she had killed, but because of who she had become while behind bars. An appeal was filed on her behalf, not just for her faith, but for her mind. Dr. Dorothy Otnow Lewis, a respected psychiatrist from NYU, testified that Velma Barfield suffered from dissociative identity disorder, and that one of her alternate personalities, a male persona named Billy, had confessed to the killings. Billy, she claimed, had emerged to protect Velma from trauma and had carried out the murders as vengeance against abusers. The judge was unmoved. "One of them did it," he said. "I don't care which one." Velma's final appeal was denied in federal court. She told her lawyers to abandon all efforts to go higher. She wanted, in her words, to die with dignity. On November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield was led to the execution chamber. She was 52 years old. She had one final statement. "I know that everyone has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everyone who has been supporting me all these 6 years." Her last meal was simple: cheese doodles and Coca-Cola. She was executed by lethal injection, the first woman in U.S. history to be put to death by that method. She was buried in a small rural cemetery near her first husband, Thomas Burke, the man many believe was her first victim. Velma had requested her organs be donated. Her heart, however, could not be restarted, but her corneas and skin tissue were recovered and given to others. Even in death, Velma tried to offer something back. But to the families she left shattered, it was too little and far too late. Her execution stirred political controversy. North Carolina's Governor Jim Hunt then running for U.S. Senate against Jesse Helms, rejected her plea for clemency, a decision that became a heated topic in his campaign. Velma Barfield's story is one of duality: a caretaker, a mother, a minister, a murderer. She killed with quiet calculation and repent with loud prayers. Whether she was a victim of abuse, a woman split by trauma, or simply a manipulator cloaked in faith, one truth remains. She smiled as she watched people die. And when justice came, she chose to face it. Velma Barfield spent her final years on death row, not as a monster, but as a minister, reading scripture, comforting fellow inmates, even earning praise from Billy Graham himself. Some believed she had changed, some believed she was mentally ill, and some believed she never stopped manipulating those around her. Her final words were laced with sorrow. "I am sorry, and I want to thank everyone who has been supporting me." On November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield became the first woman in the U.S. executed by lethal injection. Her last meal? Cheese doodles and Coca-Cola. They buried her next to her first husband, the man many believe was her very first victim. Velma left behind more than a list of names. She left behind a legacy of deception and the haunting question: how many others trusted her? Right before she watched them take their last breath,